Chapter 12, Mansions and Memories. Ever since I was small, Grandma's home always felt magic. The roof peaked steeply with a tower over the spiral staircase that led all the way up to the attic above the third floor. Its imposing silhouette and many rooms provided plenty of space for my imagination to run wild. Giant old cottonwoods stood leaflessly around the house throughout winter, and whether they creaked slowly back and forth in the wind or stood eerily still, they added to the mystery, to the feeling that a fairy tale had occurred in this very place, and not long ago. I turned off the car near the back door and climbed the wooden staircase to the porch. The old wood creaked underfoot, but the porch had been swept clean and tidy. Long years of foot traffic had worn the wood smooth. I paused to listen to that silence, impossible to find anywhere except in the country. A near tangible stillness hung in the air, clinging to the slight breeze, echoing the absence of the hum of traffic or any other sound of civilization. The silence and peace fell comfortably over the wide fields of harvested corn and wheat like a thick down comforter. The quiet calm created its own unique sense of time. In fact, time seemed to disappear altogether. As long as the chores had been finished, no rush or hurry could exist in a place like this, where one day blended so pleasantly into the next. I found it impossible to keep that peace from overflowing from the fields and pouring inside myself, spilling all the way down to my toes, filling me with a deep serenity I had never experienced anywhere else. A pair of pheasants darted across the driveway and disappeared into the short cornstalks at the edge of the fields as I leaned comfortably against a round wooden pillar on the porch. After a few deep breaths of cool, dry air, I turned and opened the door, which had likely not been locked for the last decade. "Grandma," I called into the house, "it's Spencer." I paused to listen for squeaking floorboards somewhere in the house. "Anybody home?" I shouted again. No answer. If the peaceful countryside had a powerful effect on me, this home's touch felt even stronger. Everything seemed as familiar as my family's home in Orem, where I spent 16 long years of my life. Something about the old wood and new paint, the wood-burning stoves, and the generations who were born and died here gave it substance and made it feel more real on some deep level that I did not begin to understand. "Anybody home?" I called again, stepping through the kitchen and the living room. At the base of the spiral stairway, a large white wooden ball, a little smaller than a basketball, adorned the end of the handrail. My grandfather had added this touch when I was a child, and I used to look into it and tell stories as if it were a crystal ball. The nostalgia of my younger years flooded over me as I suddenly realized that I now stood in the future I had imagined so often as a child. Of course, the present had little in common with the fantasies I invented then. As it turns out, this crystal ball only had the power to look backward in time. I walked upstairs and down the hall to a small bedroom with 2 beds where my older brother and I had stayed from time to time. The thin crack still ran through the middle of the door, and the floorboards creaked beneath my feet in the hallway. This same sound would warn me when Grandpa was coming to wake me up when I spent summers here before I turned 10. I would wake up before he walked into the room and put his large hand on my shoulder, but I would pretend to be dreaming anyway. "Hey, city boy," he used to whisper. "You want to help me squeeze some fresh cow juice for Grandma?" I'd roll over slowly and stretch, then pull back the thick quilts and get dressed before going out to the barn to help milk. "Nothing like getting up at the crack of dawn, is there?" he'd always say as I walked groggily into the barn. Of course, he'd have been up for an hour or two already doing other chores, but it made me feel like a real rancher, and I still remember the love in his eyes as I beamed back at him wordlessly. I suddenly felt the overwhelming urge to run outside to the barn and start milking again, to reach back to the past and pull myself into its comforting arms. But the cows were gone, along with the rest of the animals and Grandpa himself. Now others farmed the land and paid enough rent to take care of all of Grandma's needs. Grandpa passed away a year ago last September, just as the aspen and cottonwood leaves began to glow their bright yellows and reds in the nearby foothills. I missed him. The barn now only held Grandpa's old truck and other odd items that would probably spend the rest of eternity in storage there. I walked back downstairs and outside anyway, suddenly unable to bear the emptiness of the house. Wandering into the barn, I found an axe leaning up against the wall near the woodpile. I pulled off my coat and set to chopping sections of logs into pieces that would fit into the wood-burning stoves. The air felt cold at first, but swinging the heavy axe warmed me quickly. The activity cleared my mind, and I soon felt calm again. After 10 or 15 minutes, I stopped and replaced the axe. By now, sweat ran down my forehead, and the cold air bit at my throat and lungs with each deep breath. I walked to the doorway and leaned against the rough wood and old red paint with my hands shoved deep into my pockets. Then, for the second time today, a feeling of deep peace and love washed over and through me. I hadn't felt so good or relaxed for months, maybe years. I breathed deeply and wondered what it was that made me feel so wonderfully happy, yet still sent a tear spilling down my cold cheek. Chapter 13. Grandma. A car pulled up and stopped in front of the house, gravel crunching beneath its tires. I picked up my coat and walked inside for a drink of water, and as I drained the glass, Grandma walked through the front door. I set the glass on the counter and walked into the living room to meet her. The sight that met my eyes startled me. Grandma looked older than I had ever seen her. She moved slowly and carefully, her head hanging low. She was in her mid-70s, but I had never really thought of her as old until right now. She always seemed so youthful, so energetic and warm. The image of her I carried in my mind was of her holding hands with Grandpa, laughing together or singing around the old piano on Christmas Eve. I repressed the initial urge to run forward and shout, "Surprise!" and paused in the doorway instead. "Merry Christmas, Grandma," I said gently. She startled slightly and looked up. Suddenly a spark ignited in her eyes. "Spencer!" She stepped forward, her head up now, the old familiar energy restored. "You're early! Has your whole family come?" I breathed a little sigh of relief to see her back to her old self. "Nope, just me, Gram." By this time, our arms were around each other and squeezing tight. I breathed another sigh of relief as I noted how hard she could still squeeze. Maybe she had only looked old for a moment. Maybe I had nothing to worry about. "So," she said as she stepped back and looked me over, "what brings you here so early?" I had forgotten all about planning my story. It seemed ridiculous now anyway. As long as it was the truth, it was good enough for Grandma. "Actually, I just felt like it." Grandma smiled at this, and I watched warm tears well up in her eyes. "Well, I certainly am happy to see you. Thank you for coming." "I'm glad I did. You'll have to tell me all about your classes and friends." She emphasized friends just enough to imply girlfriends as well. "There's not much to tell," I confessed, "but I do have a date tonight. We're going to the high school play." "A date?" she asked, looking surprised. "Who's the lucky girl?" "Her name's Annetta. She works at the diner by the highway." "Oh, Annetta Hall. She is a very sweet girl. I didn't know you knew her," she said, knitting her brow slightly. "Well, we just met, actually. I stopped there on my way through town. What do you know about her?" "Oh, she's simply wonderful. You two will get along just fine. I imagine she'll rather enjoy having someone her age to talk to." Grandma looked at me thoughtfully for a moment, and I wondered if she was imagining Annetta and I as a couple. "It's too bad," Grandma began, then stopped. "What?" I asked curiously. "Nothing," Grandma answered, waving off whatever she was about to say. "I shouldn't spoil anything by telling you what she can tell you better herself. By the way," she added, "does your family know you've come?" When I paused, she added, "I'll give them a call. You'd better get ready."